when God's voice echoes through a woman, Israel was drowning in darkness. After Ehud's death, the people once again did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. It was a cycle of decline, repeated like a relentless echo. Disobedience, oppression, crying out, deliverance. Now, under the yoke of Jabin, king of Canaan, the nation groaned. His capital was Hazor, and his military commander Sisera, a name that made even the bravest tremble, commanded 900 iron chariots, crushing any hint of resistance. For 20 years, Sisera oppressed Israel cruelly, like an unbearable weight on the shoulders of a weary people. But in the midst of this darkness, a woman dared to rise, not with a sword, but with authority. Not with physical strength, but with wisdom and the voice of God. Deborah, the wife of Lapidoth, judged Israel under a palm tree between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. The people went up to her to settle disputes, to seek counsel, and to hear the truth. There was no throne, no crown, no weapons. There was discernment, there was courage, there was anointing. Deborah wasn't just a judge, she was a prophetess. And when she spoke, her words pierced like spears, not because she shouted, but because they carried the weight of divine will. In a patriarchal culture, in an age of male dominance, Deborah stood out not through rebellion, but through obedience. She listened, she saw, she discerned, and when the time came, she acted. One morning, Deborah sent for Barak, son of Abinoam, from Kadesh in Naphtali. He arrived with wary eyes, unsure why a woman would summon him for a matter of war. But she didn't ask for permission. She issued a command. "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go gather 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, and lead them to Mount Tabor. There I will deliver Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and troops, into your hands." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a call, a direct mission from heaven. But Barak hesitated. Even with the promise of victory, he replied with fear disguised as condition. "If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." His faith was conditional, his heart divided, and Deborah, without showing surprise, answered firmly, "Yes, I will go with you. But know this, because of the path you've chosen, the honor of victory will not be yours. For the Lord will deliver Sisera into the hands of a woman." This response wasn't vengeance, nor contempt. It was prophecy, a warning that God would use whoever was willing, man or woman, leader or outsider. When God's eyes search, it's not gender he sees, but the heart. And Deborah had a bold heart, a listening heart, a ready heart. The mobilization happened with precision. Barak gathered the men of Naphtali and Zebulun and climbed Mount Tabor. Deborah was with him, a woman among warriors, a prophetess among spears. But there she wasn't an uncomfortable exception. She was the presence that brought conviction. While Barak led armies, Deborah led visions. She was the bridge between the invisible and the visible, the channel between divine will and human execution. Deborah's presence didn't diminish Barak. It only exposed how much God could work through unexpected paths. Sisera's army advanced, with metallic arrogance. The iron chariots roared in the valley of Kishon, confident they would crush another Israelite uprising. But on that day, the wheels would not turn in their favor. Deborah looked at Barak with eyes full of authority and said, "Get up. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. The Lord is marching ahead of you." It wasn't just motivation, it was prophetic direction. And Barak descended Mount Tabor with the 10,000 men, while the heavens began to conspire in Israel's favor. The valley of Kishon became the stage of a tactical miracle. Suddenly clouds covered the sky and rain began to pour, not just any rain, torrential. Sisera's iron chariots, once so imposing, got stuck in the mud, became useless. What had been a symbol of power became a prison. What was a tool of oppression turned into a trap. Sisera's army was scattered. Every soldier was defeated. Not one survived. Sisera, desperate, abandoned his chariot and fled, on foot seeking refuge, trying to save his life. But the prophecy still had a name to fulfill. The honor of the victory would not belong to Barak. And while he chased the shadows of the Canaanite army, Sisera found the tent of Heber the Kenite, an ally of Jabin. There he found Jael, Heber's wife, a discreet woman, a tent away from sight, a promise of shelter. Jael welcomed him gently, gave him milk, covered him with a blanket, and calmed him. Sisera, exhausted, slept, but Jael knew. She knew who he was. She knew what had to be done. And with a hammer and a tent peg, she etched her name into history with boldness. The Canaanite commander died at the hands of a woman, just as Deborah had foretold. The next day, Barak arrived, still in pursuit, and Jael called him. "Come, and I will show you the man you're looking for." There lay Sisera, fallen, lifeless, defeated not by a sword, but by the hand of a determined woman. That day Israel began to overcome Jabin, king of Canaan, and the oppression came to an end. But the victory wasn't just Israel's. It also belonged to Deborah's bold leadership. It was the cry that God raises whoever he wants. It was the echo that divine authority does not bow to human stigmas. History wasn't just written. It was rewritten by the hands of a woman who dared to listen, dared to speak, and dared to lead. Deborah didn't ask for permission. She answered the call. A song of war, a song of women. Israel had seen countless battles, but never had a victory come with such divine choreography. Rain from heaven, panic in the enemy ranks, and a woman, not from the army, not from a royal bloodline, but from a tent, struck the final blow. The story was complete. The silence of oppression had been shattered. But Deborah, the prophetess, the judge, the leader who dared to trust God beyond norms and names, wasn't finished. Victories are solidified not just by what happens on the battlefield, but by how they are remembered. And Deborah knew that stories live longer when they are sung. That is how legacies are born, not only with swords, but with words. And so she sang. The song of Deborah and Barak echoed through the hills of Israel. But it wasn't just a song of military triumph. It was a declaration, a manifesto, a vision of what happens when people rise, not in rebellion, but in obedience. When the princes in Israel take the lead, when the people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. She started by honoring the ones who chose to rise. She didn't take the glory for herself. She pointed to the collective courage, to the divine hand behind the scenes, and to those who said yes when it would have been easier to stay silent. Her voice wasn't fragile, it was commanding. It didn't seek applause, it brought accountability. "Hear this, you kings. Listen, you rulers. Even I will sing to the Lord. I will praise the Lord, the God of Israel, in song." Her tone cut through pride and pretension. She reminded every leader, every warrior, every tribe that the glory of victory belonged not to the strong arms or the fast chariots, but to the God who moved mountains and summoned storms. She recalled how the earth shook, how the heavens poured, how the mountains trembled before the Lord. Her song painted a vivid picture. God was not distant. He fought, he led, he acted, and he chose unexpected vessels to carry his will, but her words also exposed. She praised the tribes who came to fight, Zebulun, Naphtali, but openly questioned those who remained passive. "Why did you stay among the sheep pens? To hear the whistling for the flocks?" She addressed Reuben's indecision, Gilead's distance, Dan's distractions, Asher's comfort. Deborah wasn't afraid to confront those who refused to stand. Her leadership wasn't about pleasing. It was about truth. A woman singing, yes, but her lyrics pierced like arrows. She held tribes accountable not to shame them, but to awaken them, to call them to something higher. The song shifted to the battle itself, how the kings of Canaan fought at Taanach by the waters of Megiddo, yet gained no silver, no glory. The stars in the heavens fought against Sisera, aligning with God's purpose. The Kishon River swept them away. Not just soldiers lost, symbols of pride dissolved. Deborah didn't just recount what happened. She interpreted it. She gave meaning to the chaos. She reminded Israel that God had not forgotten them, that every natural force bowed to his word, that when women and men step forward in alignment with heaven, even the skies fight on their behalf. Then the sharpest moment of the song arrived. Most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Deborah's praise was not poetic, flattery, it was divine recognition. Jael, a woman from the margins, had accomplished what no warrior could. While Sisera asked for water, she gave him milk. While he slept with confidence, she moved with purpose. While he trusted in his escape, she sealed his fate. Deborah described it with bold detail. She struck his head, she crushed his skull, she shattered and pierced his temple. These were not words of savagery. They were declarations of justice. Jael's tent had become a battlefield, her hammer, a sword, her hand the hand of God in motion. The image of Sisera's mother waiting at the window brought the song to its final contrast. While Jael acted, Sisera's mother watched. While Jael took responsibility, the other expected results. Deborah's lyrics juxtaposed the action of the bold with the passivity of the privileged. Why is his chariot so long in coming? Why is the clatter of his chariots delayed? Her attendants answered with empty comfort. They are dividing the spoils. They imagined victory while defeat was already buried. It was a stinging irony. The silence of Sisera's return was louder than any trumpet. His downfall, orchestrated not by generals, but by the hands of two women, rewrote Israel's narrative. Deborah's song concluded not with self-glorification but with a prophetic hope. So may all your enemies perish, Lord, but may all who love you be like the sun when it rises in its strength. A vision of brightness after darkness. A call to love the Lord boldly, to rise like the sun, not timid, not ashamed, but radiant. Deborah's leadership didn't end on the battlefield. It expanded through remembrance, through testimony, through poetry. She shaped how a nation saw women, saw leadership, saw divine intervention. And then the land had peace for 40 years. That peace didn't come through treaties. It came through obedience, through boldness, through the willingness of a woman who heard from God, spoke with clarity, acted without fear, and sang without apology. Deborah didn't need to dress as a man to lead. She led as a woman, fully aware of her identity, fully submitted to her calling. Her voice was not just a disruption, it was a restoration, a realignment, a song that shook foundations and built futures. When courage defies the norm, the story of Deborah did not end with Jael's hammer nor with the echoes of her song. What she stirred in Israel reached deeper than military success. It was a spiritual reawakening, a collective remembrance, a rediscovery of what it meant to stand in the identity God had written for them, not the identity imposed by fear, tradition, or social structure. For 40 years, peace reigned in Israel. But that peace didn't rest on the shoulders of kings or the permanence of treaties. It rested on a generation stirred by a woman who refused to be silent, a woman who didn't wait for permission to speak what God had placed in her. The tribes began to reorient themselves. The disputes that once ended in confusion and injustice now found wisdom under Deborah's palm tree. Her role as judge was not one of domination but discernment. She didn't rule by force. She led by clarity. Men came not out of obligation, but because her voice carried the echo of truth. She didn't intimidate. She illuminated. While others clung to customs, Deborah moved according to revelation. She became the embodiment of what it meant to serve as a conduit of divine justice, not above the people, but among them. Fathers began telling their daughters the story of the woman who stood beside generals and didn't flinch. Mothers pointed to the hills where Deborah once summoned Barak and taught their sons that courage had many forms. Some carried swords, others carried prophecy. Some charged into battle, others stood when no one else did. Deborah became more than a hero. She became a reference point, a disruption in a system that had taught generations to see leadership through a single lens. In her, the people saw something they had forgotten, that God's power is not bound to tradition and his voice is not limited by gender. Still, with peace came complacency. Israel's history was built on cycles, faithfulness followed by forgetfulness, trust followed by idolatry. Deborah saw the signs. Though the land was quiet, the hearts of the people slowly drifted toward comfort. Peace had become routine, and routine had begun to dull their reverence. But Deborah did not fear disruption. She used her voice not just to celebrate what had passed, but to guard what had been gained. She met with leaders. She walked the cities. She revisited the tribes. She spoke not with nostalgia but with urgency. Do not forget who fought for you. Do not forget the God who reigns from heaven and defeats iron with mud. The children of Israel needed constant reminding. They were prone to chase what sparkled, forget what saved them, and make peace with compromise. But Deborah was a wall. She didn't allow decline to go unchecked. She challenged the elders. She confronted indifference. Her leadership was not seasonal, it was consistent, and consistency is rare, especially from those who had already tasted honor. But Deborah didn't seek legacy. She sought obedience. Even when applause faded, she stood in position. Even when voices grew tired, hers remained clear. She gathered women to teach them. She told them the stories behind the battle, the prayer, the fear, the listening. She didn't hide her hesitation or mask her vulnerability. She told the truth. That boldness is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to bow to it. Young girls sat at her feet not to dream of fame, but to recognize their own voice. She didn't train warriors. She shaped visionaries, women who would one day speak when others silenced them, who would one day say yes to God before asking if the world was ready. Men came too, not because they needed a woman to tell them what to do, but because Deborah never tried to prove herself above them. She stood with them. Her strength didn't threaten their calling. It ignited it. She challenged Barak not to expose his fear, but to awaken his faith. And now she challenged the fathers, the elders, the shepherds to remember that leadership was not reserved for a few, but required the courage to listen when God speaks, no matter through whom he chooses to speak. It was in those quiet years that Deborah's impact deepened. No battlefield, no song, no thunder, just the slow work of planting truth into people who had once forgotten it. She mentored the next judges. She preserved the law. She kept alive the memory of what it means when heaven invades earth through someone fully available. And yet, she never claimed ownership of the movement. She knew her time would pass. And she didn't cling to power. She prepared others to carry it. That is leadership, not centralizing control, but multiplying courage. She visited jail once again. The tent was the same, but jail had changed. She was no longer just the woman of the moment. She was the woman who had redefined the edge of obedience. They sat together, two women who had defied every expectation, not by rising against men, but by rising with God. Jael shared how people whispered her name now with awe or suspicion, how some praised her boldness while others questioned it. Deborah listened, then said, "You don't answer to their memory. You answered God's command. Let that be enough." Time passed, but Deborah's influence didn't fade. She never wore armor, but she trained those who would. She never crowned herself, but her legacy crowned generations. And when the day came that her voice grew softer, her impact only grew louder, for she had created a space where women could lead without apology, where men could follow without insecurity, and where a nation could rise through obedience, not tradition. Deborah did not change Israel by fighting battles. She changed Israel by refusing to stay silent when God had spoken. And through that unwavering courage, she became not just a judge of her people, but a guardian of their identity. Peace reigned for decades, but the boldness she released would echo far beyond them. Beyond the tree. The rise of a generation. Deborah's seat under the palm tree had become a symbol, not of power, but of presence, a place where people came not only to settle disputes, but to be reminded of who they were. It wasn't just justice she delivered, it was vision. For years, that tree was more than a meeting point. It was a root system, the place where truth grew, where identity was restored, and where a forgotten people began to rise again, not by accident, but by conviction. And as the seasons changed and her voice reached new ears, Deborah knew her role had shifted from warrior to cultivator. She began to invest not just in those who came with problems, but in those who came with questions. Young women who had once watched from the margins now sat close, not to witness miracles but to learn how to walk with God when the fire dims. They asked not how to be like her, but how to be faithful to the call within them. Deborah didn't offer formulas. She offered honesty. She told them of her doubts, her late nights, her trembling voice when she first called Barak. She told them that boldness is built in layers, that it doesn't arrive in a moment, but is formed in private battles. Some of them would become judges. Others would become prophets. Most would return to their villages carrying a new kind of fire, not loud, but steady. Deborah was not interested in creating copies of herself. She was building a future where no one would be shocked when a woman led, spoke, or stood. She taught them to hear God's voice before chasing a platform. She reminded them that the greatest victories are often invisible, that the legacy of leadership isn't fame, it's faithfulness. It's showing up when no one notices, praying when no one listens, believing when nothing changes. Meanwhile, the elders who once hesitated to follow Deborah now stood as allies, not because they suddenly accepted every part of her role, but because her consistency had broken their resistance. What they once saw as unorthodox, they now recognized as undeniable. They had witnessed a nation turn from fear to peace through the leadership of a woman who never demanded submission but demonstrated surrender. Slowly, the culture shifted, not in sweeping reforms, but in quiet acknowledgments, in conversations around fires, in fathers encouraging their daughters to ask God what He had for them, not what the world would allow. But influence always draws opposition. Though Israel enjoyed peace, outside voices began to question their direction. Neighboring regions, still rooted in patriarchal rigidity, whispered of Israel's softness, their reliance on a prophetess rather than a prince. Some leaders within began to echo those doubts. Will peace endure without strength? They asked. Shouldn't a man lead again? Deborah didn't respond with debate. She responded with clarity. Peace doesn't come from image. It comes from alignment with God. Her confidence wasn't arrogance. It was rooted in years of obedience. She wasn't defending her position. She was protecting the people from the seduction of tradition dressed as strength. She called a gathering, not of warriors, but of witnesses. People who had seen the victories, who had tasted freedom. She asked them one question. What did you see when God moved? Some said lightning. Others said justice. One voice, young and clear, said, I saw a woman who believed Him. Deborah smiled, not because the words praised her, but because they proved that something had shifted. The nation no longer looked for strength in appearance, but in obedience. And that was the victory she treasured most. In the following years, the structure of leadership changed. Judges were no longer selected solely by lineage or tribe, but by discernment. Men and women who carried God's voice with humility were invited to serve. Not all accepted. Some feared what it might cost. Others questioned their worth. But Deborah's legacy whispered louder than their fears. If God has spoken, you do not need permission to obey. That phrase became a cornerstone for the next generation. It traveled beyond Israel into songs, into tents, into the hearts of people who had never even seen her face. One day, Deborah returned to the battlefield of Megiddo, not to relive the glory, but to teach. She stood where the stars had once fought, where the Kishon River had swallowed the pride of Sisera's army. She pointed to the plains and said to the children, This is not just where we won. This is where we remembered who fights for us. She knelt and touched the ground. And this earth? It didn't need chariots. It needed faith. Her words were simple, but they left a mark deeper than weapons. In her final years, Deborah wrote, not songs of war, but letters of wisdom. She wrote to the daughters she had mentored, to the men she had challenged, to the judges who would follow. Her letters weren't filled with strategies, but with reminders. Never lead to prove, lead to serve, never speak to be heard. Speak because God has spoken. She signed each one with a phrase few knew, but all recognized once they read it. Under the palm I listened. Deborah died as she lived, not in fanfare but in faith. And though her body rested, her voice remained. In the hills, in the scrolls, in the heartbeat of a nation that once thought leadership looked only one way, but now knew it could wear a mantle of humility, of clarity, of strength wrapped in surrender. Her palm tree stood long after, weathered but unbroken, like her story, like her legacy. The song that didn't end, the song Deborah and Barak sang after the defeat of Sisera, didn't fade with the years. It transformed. What began as celebration became a teaching, then a legacy. The people who once cowered under oppression now walked with a different posture, not of pride, but of memory. Memory of a time when heaven fought alongside earth, when rain answered injustice, and when a woman's voice led a nation from fear to victory. The song lived in mothers who now sang it over their children, in elders who recited its lines at feasts, and in daughters who whispered its verses when the world questioned their worth. In those years of peace, Deborah remained steady. She didn't seek elevation. She didn't build monuments. Instead, she kept returning to the place of listening. The palm tree became more than a seat. It became a symbol of spiritual alignment. People came not to hear solutions, but to be reminded of what God had already said. Deborah never made herself the source. She pointed them back, always back, to the one who stirred her spirit long before any battle was won. That posture of humility kept her leadership rooted and her nation anchored. Barak continued to serve, no longer as a hesitant commander, but as a man reshaped by obedience. He and Deborah remained allies, not in war, but in wisdom. Their bond was never about hierarchy. It was forged in fire, in vulnerability, in shared surrender. He visited often, seeking counsel not just on matters of strategy, but of spirit. They talked not of chariots, but of calling, not of enemies, but of endurance. Together they began to prepare others, not just to lead, but to listen. One day, a young judge named Elior arrived. Timid, uncertain, and barely past adolescence, he confessed he had heard the voice of God but doubted what it meant. Deborah didn't give him instructions. She gave him space. She asked, "What did the voice say when no one was watching?" Elior replied, "It said, 'Stand even when you shake.'" Deborah nodded. "Then stand," she said. That was how she led, without fanfare, without control. She released people into obedience, not performance, into alignment, not ambition. Still, not all responded with faith. Some leaders grew envious of her influence. Others waited for her death to reshape the structure of power. Whispers of restoring order spread, and Deborah knew the threat was not an army this time, it was erosion. The erosion of memory, of conviction, of boldness. But she did not panic. She prayed, and then she prepared. She gathered the women she had mentored, the judges she had watched rise, and the prophets who had remained hidden in the crowd. She didn't give them new instructions. She reminded them of their first ones. God spoke before you were seen. That is where your strength lies. Don't trade revelation for recognition. Her words sank deeper than commands. They became compass points for a generation that would one day lead without applause, fight without swords, and build without credit. Deborah also made time to visit Jael's family. Jael had passed, but her children lived with the weight and wonder of their mother's act. Some called it violent, others called it divine. Deborah called it obedient. Your mother did not kill, she told them. She intervened. She heard heaven in the silence of a tent. That sentence reframed their grief. It wasn't just their story, it was part of Israel's deliverance. And deliverance often looks different through the eyes of obedience than through the eyes of tradition. In the last years of her life, Deborah withdrew from public rulings but remained present in the background. When asked why she no longer sat under the tree, she answered simply, "The tree doesn't need me anymore. Its roots are in you." That was her goal all along, to be a season, not a system, to ignite something that didn't depend on her, to survive. And she succeeded. For even when she wasn't seen, her voice still shaped decisions. Her silence still echoed through the choices of those she had mentored. One final time, she was asked to speak before the tribes. It was a gathering to honor the 40 years of peace Israel had known. Deborah stepped forward, not as a legend, but as a servant. Her words were brief. Peace does not come from the absence of war, but from the presence of justice. Justice is not a policy. It is a person who listens to God and acts without delay. Be that person, and you will have peace. Then she stepped back. No applause, just silence. A silence that carried more weight than celebration. And so the song continued, not with verses, but with lives, with decisions made in hidden places, with women who rose not to defy men, but to fulfill God's voice, with men who followed not out of weakness, but out of honor. Deborah's boldness had never been about defiance. It had always been about faith. Faith that God speaks through the unexpected. Faith that obedience is louder than tradition. Faith that when you rise where no one expects you to stand, heaven fights alongside you. That was the song, and it never ended. Her legacy in the silence years passed, and Deborah's name no longer echoed in daily speech but in quiet decisions. Her voice was no longer heard in the campfires or the city gates, but in the way leaders paused before speaking, in how justice was weighed with compassion, and in how daughters and sons were taught to listen first, speak second. Her leadership had been like a wind, unseen but undeniable. And though the world around Israel continued to change, something remained steady beneath the surface. It was the imprint of a woman who dared to obey God in full view of a doubtful world. The palm tree remained, though weathered, its leaves more sparse, its bark marked by time. Yet it still stood. Travelers stopped there not for judgment but for reflection. Stories were told, not of Deborah's victories, but of her faith. The children of those she mentored returned with their own families, pointing to the base of the tree and saying, "She listened here." It wasn't a shrine, it was a memory. A reminder that spiritual authority doesn't require a title, only obedience. That real leadership doesn't vanish, it multiplies. In the years after her death, Israel's peace endured longer than many expected. Conflicts arose, as they always do, but the memory of Deborah's leadership restrained rashness and inspired courage. New judges were appointed, some strong in strategy, others in spirit, but all remembered her, not through rituals, but through habits. They asked questions before assuming answers. They fasted before declaring war. They listened before commanding. And when asked where they learned to lead that way, they would smile and say, "Under the tree." One of those judges, a woman named Tirzah, once confessed that she never met Deborah in person. She had only read the scrolls and heard the stories. Yet every decision she made was guided by Deborah's example. She said, "I do not need her voice to hear her heart." That was the kind of legacy Deborah left, not one built on proximity, but on pattern. A pattern of humility, of clarity, of courage. Tirzah would later become known, not as the second Deborah, but as the first Tirzah, and that was exactly how Deborah would have wanted it. Over time, songs were written again, not about battles but about roots. One of them spoke of a tree that never moved but changed a nation. Another spoke of a judge who made no demands but carried heaven's authority. These songs didn't chart on records or get sung in palaces. They were sung in homes, in fields, by mothers who believed their daughters could lead, by fathers who saw prophecy in the eyes of their children, by communities that stopped asking if a woman could lead and started asking if the Spirit had spoken. Historians tried to define her impact with timelines and scrolls, But those who lived in her legacy knew it couldn't be measured in dates. It was measured in choices, in how fear lost its grip, in how worship returned to villages, in how Israel learned to recognize the move of God, even when it came wrapped in a voice they weren't expecting. Deborah had changed more than her nation's fate. She changed its filter. From that point on, Israel began to ask less, "Who is speaking?" and more, "Is God speaking through them?" As generations came and went, some tried to rewrite her story to soften its edges, to frame her leadership as an anomaly rather than a model. But truth has a way of surviving edits. Whenever justice broke through corruption, her name reappeared. Whenever a woman rose in boldness, the elders recalled her with quiet respect. And whenever Israel faced impossible odds, they remembered that once under a palm tree heaven answered through someone no one expected. In the silence of time, her legacy didn't fade, it deepened. Like seeds beneath the soil, her influence pushed through in moments no one connected to her at first. A wise word in court, a peaceful decision in a council, a prophetic dream shared in a village. All traceable back to a woman who believed that faith was stronger than form and obedience louder than opposition. The scrolls that recorded her life were preserved not in gold or stone, but in worn parchment, touched often, read slowly. They didn't exaggerate her. They didn't need to. Her story was already astonishing. A woman who judged without ambition, who led without title, who saw without bias, and who moved because heaven whispered, "Now." She had no crown, no sword, no throne, only a tree, and a willingness to speak what others feared to hear. Her memory became more than inspiration. It became standard, not a bar few could reach, but a blueprint many could follow. And so, Deborah's final gift wasn't her leadership. It was the legacy she refused to control. She didn't hold the future. She released it. She didn't cling to influence. She planted it. And the silence she left behind was not emptiness. It was space for others to rise. And rise they did.